And here we go. Oh, John Tent is already here from Virginia. Welcome, welcome. And Don Williams, who's instructing us more or less, I think more than less at the moment, but there he is. So, greetings. Tonight we're doing Doesn't the Bible Support Genocide? We're kind of talking about, in a big issue, the question of is God a moral monster? Someone wrote a book like that.
Paul Gilbert did that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
that.
so Dr. Williams, why don't you lead on?
Well, I want to back up a little bit, give this some context. I taught apologetics at Tacoma Falls College for years, and one of the elements of that course was that the students had to do debates.
Mm.
Every student had to do two debates or be in a team that did debates. One where he was representing the Christian position, the other one where he was representing an atheist or skeptical position or heretical, whatever, depending on what the apologetic issue was. And some years ago, I began to notice something that was happening in the debate on the trustworthiness of Scripture. So there'd be two students be assigned to debate this topic. And the guy who was in the role of the Christian, hopefully they were both Christians, but one of them was actually playing a Christian. He would assume that he already knew what he needed to do. And so he would come in and he would have all this material about the historicity and the accuracy and the number of manuscripts we have, how solid the text is, and all these reasons why the Bible is historically trustworthy and why we can believe what it says.
Mm-hmm.
The guy playing the atheist would kick his butt because he would realize that he didn't know what he needed to say. So he would actually go to atheist websites to see what they were saying. And he would get up and he would say, well, that's all very interesting, but who cares? The Bible is an immoral book. The Bible supports genocide. It supports racism. It supports slavery. It supports the oppression of women and homosexuals, homophobia. The Bible is an immoral book, and anybody who believes it and bases his life on it is an immoral person. Who cares if it's inspired, and who cares if it's true? If it's inspired, that just makes it worse because the Bible's an immoral book. Mm-hmm. And the guy on the Christian side of the debate would get this deer in the headlights look. It was like he had no idea how to respond to that. And I realized that the ground has shifted and the questions are changing. And so if you go onto a secular campus or into a secular workplace nowadays, a lot of times, and start actually talking to non-Christians, these are the things you're going to get. These are the questions you're going to get. These are the attacks you're going to get. Now, obviously, we still have to be able to defend the inspiration and the total trustworthiness of the Bible. But if we're not prepared to deal with some of these other issues, we're just going to get left in the dust. Mm-hmm. Because this is where the discussion has gone. And so for the next several weeks, we're going to look at a number of these issues that sort of group into this general topic of, is the Bible an immoral book? I mean, for most of history, most of modern history since biblical times, for most of my life, and probably most of your lives too that are listening, unless you're younger, people who had no clue what the Bible said, people who had no real personal commitment to Christ, still basically thought the Bible was the good book and that it was the basis of morality and that it taught actual morality. Now, whether they had any interest in following it or not, as opposed to seeing what they could get away with, was a whole different question. But people gave the Bible credit for being on the side of right. And even if they didn't believe the miracles or didn't think that the Bible obligated them to make Jesus Lord of their lives, they still thought of it as the good book. That's not true anymore. I mean, well, there are probably still a lot of people like that left, but that increasingly is not the world we live in. So, is the Bible an immoral book? That's the default setting that you're going to increasingly be getting with people, and we better be prepared to respond to it.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I'd like to jump in for a second.
Bull by the biggest horns he's got, and deal with this whole. You're going to hear people saying this, that the Bible supports genocide. Why? Because the Israelites were commanded to wipe out the Canaanites when they invaded the Promised Land. Don,
can I interrupt a second? Yeah. Because I want to weigh in on what you just said about where culture's at. And we've written on this a lot. And if we follow the track, we had a largely Judeo-Christian ethos and morality until probably the 1980s. It was wearing off over the century. By the time you get into the 1990s, well, in the 80s, we had sort of a Christian hangover. We still held to a Judeo-Christian morality. In the 1990s, the hangover wore off. And now it's all bets are off as well. I can live however I want. There is no God. I can make my own decisions. And it is somehow immoral to even think there's a morality, except they have to appeal to morality to make that argument. So that doesn't make sense either. But you're right. That's where we're at. We have to really start back where Paul was at in the first century.
Yep.
Yeah, the world in many ways is more like the world faced by the early Christians than it is the world that we have been used to, with one major difference, and that is the early Christians were the edgy new guys coming in, and we're the old fuddy-duddies being swept aside. At least that's the way we're perceived.
Right.
The radical nature of biblical teaching and of the life that is offered in Christ is something people don't get because, frankly, too many of us are just boring and aren't really living the adventure of following Jesus and living the life of faith in Him. Well, tonight we're gonna break these issues down in several different ways. Tonight we're going to think about does the Bible support genocide? Does the Bible really support genocide? I mean, in such a way that all that stuff about loving your enemy and everything, you can't really take it seriously. It's just a bunch of hogwash if you're supposed to wipe out everything that breathes when you conquer a city.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to go big picture because the next chapters we're going to be doing are all about morality, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I've been having discussions about this word objective morality. I've come to the conclusion that, it's possible somebody can say, okay, it doesn't even exist, objective morality, unless you presuppose God. So maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure you could explain how that's wrong. But if I try to stay with my chapter 9 conclusion, you wrote that, the right question, the one we should be asking, does the God of the Bible that the Bible presents to us exist? So I'm looking for a little comment on a bigger discussion of morality in general. These next 6 chapters or whatever are all morality issues. Well, how do we, if the God of the Bible does exist and it presents, then He's the moral compass. So then we just have to try to understand how some of these challenging things in the Bible make sense in terms of His plan. So I know you know all this, but I'm trying to figure what comments can we go to objective morality at a high level before we dive into all these topics relating to it,
I'm not quite sure exactly what your question is. because we covered
Yeah.
objective morality earlier and saw
Mhm.
that that there are objective truths and that moral truths can be objective truths. And
Mhm.
you're certainly right that without God, there couldn't be objective truths of any kind that were knowable by human beings, including moral truths. With God, that now becomes a possibility. And, people aren't as relativistic as they think they are. Even
True.
people who don't believe in God have to live in the real world. And if they lived in a completely immoral world, they wouldn't be able to live at all. They wouldn't survive very long. So people like Romans chapter 1 and 2, even people who don't know God have a basic concept
Right.
of morality, which is um, built into them, into their nature, and into the experience of living in a moral universe. And so if they didn't have some concept of morality, they couldn't use morality against the Bible, right?
Mhm.
In other words, if you're saying the Bible is immoral because it supports genocide, you're presupposing genocide is wrong.
Right.
Now, without God, what's your basis for saying that? You don't have one.
Right.
All you can say, like we talked about a few weeks ago, all you can really say on a secular basis is, I don't like genocide.
Right.
It's a matter of
Can't say
opinion.
it's objectively wrong,
Yeah.
but people are always trying to live on both sides of that and have their cake and eat it too. They want to say uh, Bible supporting genocide disproves the Bible because that means there's a standard in which genocide is wrong, and if you support it,
Mhm.
you're wrong. So the Bible's wrong. And then they want to be relativistic when it comes to moral laws that they feel like breaking or fudging on.
Mhm.
They want to have their relativistic cake and eat it too by being objectivists when it suits them.
Right.
So I mean that's just where people are. But people who tell you they're relativists will also tell you the Bible is wrong because it supports genocide. That's totally inconsistent. But it's also ignorant in terms of what the Bible actually does say.
Right.
And so let's get into the the biblical text and into our uh, slideshow. Why do people think the Bible supports genocide? Because on one occasion, when the Israelites were entering into the Holy Land, they were actually commanded by God to wipe out the Canaanites, or it sounds like they were. Actually, the Canaanites had the option of leaving, in which case they could still live. But this uh, is the situation. Now, why is God being so hard nosed about this? Because uh, the Canaanites were a very, very corrupt society. They were into idol worship, and they had begun to live consistently with the idea that God is somebody like the idols. Uh, and God knew that if the Israelites let these people stay and live alongside of them and intermarry with them and have normal relationships with them, they were going to drag the Israelites back down into idolatry themselves. And so uh, he tells Moses, okay, when you get ready to invade the promised land, I will deliver them into your hand and you will drive them out before you. That's an important point, is driving them out. God has said to them, you become so corrupt, I'm making Israel wait in slavery in Egypt for 400 years until you get to the point where you're really without excuse. And this is justified. And you're getting driven out, just like Israel got exiled and got driven out of the land when they disobeyed. So I'm going to drive them out before you. Now, if they don't leave, wipe them out. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, they will certainly be a snare to you. And the entire rest of the Old Testament is the fulfillment of that prediction of how things were going to go. So at this point, it's pretty harsh, but it's not genocide. But it gets worse. It gets worse. First thing we got to do is face the reality of the problem we have here with this text. So let's look at some of the other things God says to Moses and to Joshua. When the Israelites had a war with the Amorites, this was before they actually crossed the Jordan and entered the land, Israel had utterly destroyed the men, women, and children of every city of the Amorites. That's starting to sound pretty much like genocide. Next thing is, not only had they done that to the Amorites, but they are now to utterly destroy the Canaanites. Deuteronomy 7, 1-6. And what does this mean? What does it involve? They are not to leave alive anything that breathes. Men, women, children. Completely wiped out. Now I think we've got one more. Between Joshua 6:11 and Joshua 11:20. This is the pitched part of the campaign as they are conquering the land. 10 times in 5 chapters, Joshua either utterly destroyed the enemy or left no survivor. And that includes women and children. Okay. So, wow, where does that leave us? This stuff is actually in the Bible. What's the context behind all of this? The Bible does not support genocide. It commands it once and once only. But the Old Testament generally mandates a concept of limited warfare that was radically different from anything else in the ancient Near East at that time. In other words, what we need to do is distinguish the one incident where genocide took place. To say the Bible supports genocide is a completely misleading statement, because the general teaching of the Bible not only doesn't support it, it forbids it. It forbids it. So the Old Testament generally commands a concept of limited warfare. You have the lex talionis, Exodus 21:24. That's where we get the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And what most people who hear that phrase don't realize, it was a limitation. When you're punishing somebody, if your crime is you poked out somebody's eye, then the most you can do to that guy is poke out his eye. If you knocked out somebody's tooth, the worst you can do to him is knock his. In other words, the punishment of a crime has to be proportionate to the offense. You can't. somebody trips you or shoves you in line, you can't beat the living snot out of them, because that's not proportionate. And so this whole idea of limits to the force you can use against another person. The lex talionis deals with it in the general legal system of a person against another person. But when it comes to a nation against a nation, the same principles apply. Next passage is that personal vengeance is forbidden. Deuteronomy 32:35. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So in your general approach to other human beings, you've got to restrain yourself, and punishment has to fit the crime, not be disproportionate to it. And personal vengeance is just out, not allowed. When you apply that general ethical framework to the topic of war, Deuteronomy chapter 20 is an important chapter on this topic, because that is where you get the general teaching about warfare. And it has three really interesting provisions in the light of this topic. Number one is you are required to offer terms of peace. When you are at war with another city, you are required to offer them terms. You can't just go wipe them out. You've got to negotiate with them and offer them terms of peace. It's not an option. It's not a strategical, tactical decision. It's a policy. Now, if they reject those terms, then the war continues, and it, reaches whatever results it's going to reach. But the idea of making peace is actually part of your whole approach to conflict and war. Only combatants may be killed. You're not allowed to attack the women and the children. In general terms, the general teaching about war, the basic principles of how to do war is limited warfare. Only enemy soldiers can be targeted, attacked, and killed. And in cases where, even in cases where it sounds like genocide is taking place, exceptions are granted for faith. Rahab, for example, in Jericho, was spared because she decided to follow the true God and to protect the spies. And so she and her family were spared, which raises the possibility, certainly, that maybe other people could have been spared too. So when you look at the general ethical framework in terms of what are the ethical principles that apply to human conflict in general and national conflict and war in particular, the general teaching on war is anything but supporting genocide. In fact, it is explicitly forbidden. You're not supposed to do that. Well, people who will tell you the Bible supports genocide generally are completely ignorant about the big picture that you see on this page. Or if they're not completely ignorant of it, they deliberately completely ignore it because, of course, it makes their case that the Bible is a genocidal book seem stronger. In fact, it's not, because the context is important. Okay, so that raises the question then. What it does is when you understand that larger context, it helps you frame the question in a more intelligent manner. And the question is this: why does God command once what he normally forbade? Okay, so you can't hide the fact that, in fact, in the invasion of the Holy Land, in the invasion of the Promised Land, in the campaign against the Canaanites, uh, genocide or genocidal features were part of that. There's no point denying that. In fact, you were supposed to kill everything that breathes if the people resisted and fought and tried to stay, because you weren't supposed to leave any of that left. Why is that a contradiction? Why would God say you can't do this and then tell people to do it? Well, there are a lot of things that that you might tell your kids in general not to do, that in a specific situation or in a specific time, maybe you want them to do. Okay, so you tell your kids, don't play in the street, right? And they've got a limit. There's a point in the yard they're not supposed to go past, and they're not supposed to play in the street. But if your neighborhood's having a block party, you might tell them, "Hey, let's go out and get involved in this stickball game out here in the street." It's like there can easily be a situation where you would generally tell people not to do something, but there might be an exception for a specific reason. The reason for this exception is God's judgment on the Amorites. Genesis 15:16. God tells, I think it's Joseph, that or Abraham. God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to be oppressed in Egypt, and they will have to wait until the iniquity of the Amorites is full.
The fourth generation.
Israel has to wait. They have to put up with being in slavery for 400 years, waiting for the time when God says, okay, now the situation in the world is such that I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to judge the Canaanites because their iniquity is full now. And in doing that, I'm going to give my people a land. That's what God is going to do. And so the Amorites are going to get wiped out. Now, in fact, the Israelites didn't fully obey this commandment. The Jebusites, for example, were never pushed out of Jerusalem. There were places, there were individual towns like Jericho where they pretty much followed through on their instructions, their commandments. Other places where they kind of halfway did it. Non-Israelites were left in the land, and they, in fact, ensnared many Israelites into idolatry, just as God had predicted. And God had told them, don't let this happen. Don't leave anybody left of this culture, because it's gotten so evil, I've decided to wipe it out. And I'm going to use you to do it because I also need to fulfill my promise to Abraham and give you the promised land. And we're going to kill those two birds with the same stone. So that's the general historical situation. That's the rationale why God, in this one situation, commands what he normally forbids. Generally, you're not supposed to do this. This one time, it's actually what you need to do. So, can we really believe that it could be just and right for God to give such a commandment on this one occasion? Well, let's phrase the question this way. Can we imagine a society so corrupt that razing it to the ground and starting over is the only adequate solution to how to deal with it? Can we imagine a society that became so corrupt that razing it to the ground and starting over, not leaving anything, is the only viable solution? I think that we can. And I think that we are in a unique position of history where we actually can imagine this. And my example is ISIS. Recall some of the videos. So some of the videos I watched really got my attention because they were evil on a level that we have not seen since the Nazis and the Holocaust. Actually, communism in Russia and in China matched it and exceeded it. But, you know, Stalin was pretty much content just to kill 20 million peasants in order to create the perfect society. These guys, here's what got my attention. Video that they shot themselves to brag to the world about what they were doing. And they were torturing people to death. They were putting them in cages and lowering them into the river or the lake so that they would just drown, or they were burning them to death. You know, it was, and you had these little kids, 5 or 6 year old kids, who were jumping up and down, gleefully celebrating this, and their mothers egging them on in the background. Whoa. Now, I am not advocating that the United States undertake a campaign of genocide against the Islamic State. I'm not advocating that because I don't have the authority to do so, and because unless God specifically gives you an exception, we are under the general teaching of the Old Testament about limited warfare, and we don't want to sink to these people's level. You know, it would be a mistake. I am not advocating that we undertake genocide against the Islamic State or anybody else. What I'm saying is, and this is all I'm saying is, they help us imagine, when you think about that video, those little children, 6-year-old kids, jumping up and down, having a party, celebrating the torture of innocent people for the crime of not subscribing to radical Islam, and their mothers egging them on. I'm saying, you know, I can just imagine that God might at some point say, all right, that's it. That's enough. There's nothing we can do here except absolutely wipe it out. Take it down to the ground, leave nothing behind, and start over. All I'm asking you to do is imagine that there could be, I'm not saying ISIS even is that situation. I'm just saying they help us imagine the possibility of it. And if there could be, then think of the Canaanites as being people who had reached the place where God, in his righteous judgment and sovereign wisdom, had decided that is really what needs to happen. Nothing less will do. And the thing, in fact, this happened 3 times. It happened at the flood. God decided the human race was so corrupt that it needed to just be wiped out. He saved Noah and his family on the ark for a new beginning. And it happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, where those cities were completely wiped out. with the fire and brimstone. What makes the Canaanite campaign difficult is that's the only one where he uses human instruments to do it. And, that, frankly, is a challenging thing. But what we need to understand is the possibility of there being such a situation where God, nobody else, only God can say, it's got to stop. And this is the only way. It's actually got to this point where we have to take this absolutely down to the ground and leave nothing behind of it. And God could make such a judgment. He could make it righteously. And that is what the Bible presents as having happened. So, no, the Bible does not support genocide. The Bible forbids it. The Bible does not support genocide. It commanded it once while forbidding it on every other occasion. And it did so in a situation where, it takes some faith, I think, even understanding it the way we present it, it takes some faith to believe it. But it's possible to believe that, yes, God could make such a decision because he's righteous and because he's just and because he's good. And the Israelites then carried it out. So, the conclusion, the Bible does not support genocide. That's a completely misleading statement because the Bible, in its general ethical teachings about warfare, explicitly forbids it. No human being has the authority to make an exception. Even if you think ISIS would justify it, tough. None of us has the authority to make that exception. Only God retains that right. And if you want to tell me that God has told you that you have the authority, that if God's told you outside of Scripture that He wants you to do this, you're going to have a pretty high burden of proof to get me to believe He's actually talking to you, because our default setting has to be the general teaching, general ethical teaching. The Bible does not support genocide. It explicitly forbids it. No human being has the authority to make an exception. God alone retains that right, and He exercised it in this occasion. So the story contains some pretty harsh realities. ISIS and the kind of wanton cruelty they exulted in, and still would if they had a chance, that's a pretty harsh reality. And the Bible deals with reality. So it contains harsh realities, but nothing inconsistent with God's justice or His mercy. There's a point where God has to bring judgment against evildoers to express His mercy to everybody else. The Old Testament then is not cruel in reporting these realities, but realistic in dealing with them. And I think we're in a position to understand that very few people have been in. If you saw any of those videos, if you remember what was going on when ISIS was threatening to take over large chunks of the Middle East, then I think you're in that position of being able to really get your head around this in a way that has been difficult for a lot of people for a long time. And I think it's interesting that right as this has become an issue, God kind of allowed that object lesson to take place.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
So it says here, well, first off, there is a dialogue going on behind the scenes. It sounds like a television is on. It makes it a little hard to hear. I don't know if anybody else has been picking that up.
Yeah.
But my question is, it's easy to comprehend, uh, whole people groups being wiped out as adults. But, with children and babies, infants, what is your opinion of, what are your thoughts on that? I'm sure, we say God is just and he is good. And so he he's doing things, he's working all things out that way. But, for those of us who might struggle with, how can God wipe out the infants as well? How would you suggest we look at that?
I suppose he could have said, wipe them out, save the ones under 2 years old and raise them yourselves. I don't know if that would have been a feasible thing to do in a campaign like that. Yeah. What's the age of accountability? These kids in the video were very, very young, and they were old enough to know, I think. I mean, they didn't know because they've been taught the exact opposite, that what they were looking at was wrong. But I think they're old enough to be, how would you take them and reverse that damage that's already been done to their character? So yeah, if you focus on the infants, that's the hardest part of the whole thing. You think of the society as a whole, it makes a lot of sense. But I think we have to understand that our concept of the age of accountability is a sort of an artificial construct. And yeah.
How is that an artificial construct? This age of accountability.
Well, it's not in scripture anywhere.
Okay.
We just made it up. Because you go from not able to know the difference between right and wrong to knowing it. It's not like there's this moment where, oh, I get it now. It's like everything else, like even knowing that you're you can't even remember when you realize that. It just
Is it something gradual, maybe, in different people?
well, yeah, it's gradual, and nobody even remembers
Very hard to pinpoint.
crossing that threshold. By the time we can remember anything, we already were self-conscious enough and aware enough to have started that process. So
I remember watching a documentary on twins, and they were infants, and they were laying in a crib next to one another, maybe about a year old or so, and one of them actually whacked the other one because he wanted the toy. And so, even at that young age, he knew how to get what he wanted. And
they're already sinners.
Right.
From
Born
day
that
one.
way. Yes.
They're already sinners from day one, and they act out that sin in the ways that are available to them. As Augustine said, it is the weakness, not the goodness of infant limbs that constitutes their innocence.
So I find that the questions about, how does God do things in this situation, it kind of rolls into soteriology. And I think that's why it's so hard for us to kind of wrap our heads around it 100% and be in agreement on it, because, there are just some things that we don't understand how exactly it works. And I think this is one of them. It's hard.
Yeah, I think the babies are the hardest part of the whole thing. As I was saying earlier, before you even raised them, before you even brought them up, it takes some faith to accept this. But I think the uh, the considerations that we've been pointing out show us that this is faith we should exercise. You know, we weren't there, and we understand the general teaching that applies to us. This is not something we're supposed to do. It's not something the Bible recommends us doing. It's not something the Bible encourages us to do. It's not something the Bible permits us to do, uh, much less supports doing. It is something that God, in His sovereignty, did on one occasion. And I think thinking about a group like ISIS and how corrupt that is, and how far down in that culture and in the family structure that evil goes, it just helps me narrow that gap that I have to jump across in order to understand why God would decide to do this. And it was an act of His justice that uh, I can believe was justified. But let's be clear about what the issue is. It's not um, whether or not the Bible supports genocide. It doesn't. It records a genocide that was commanded by God. Uh, but even then, there were exceptions, like Rahab and her whole family were exceptions. And that makes you wonder if other people could have been exceptions too. I mean, when the Israelites left Egypt, there was a whole mixed multitude of Egyptians that went with them. Some of them probably opportunistically. It's like, it's time to light out for the territories because we're in hot water here. Let's take advantage of this opportunity. Some of them because they had been convinced that the Israelite God was the true God.
Right.
And so even as God was judging Egypt, anybody had the option of putting the blood on the doorposts. Now, the Israelites did it, but other people could have done it. And there were other people who left and who did not drown in the Red Sea, but became basically part of the nation of Israel in that process.
So how is
Rahab shows you that even as drastic as this sounds, leave nothing alive that breathes. There were loopholes and there were ways of escape for any individual that would accept the true God even back then. And we know about Rahab. It doesn't mean that she was the only one. Think about the existence of Melchizedek, for example. Abraham's running around in the desert, rescuing family members, and runs into this Melchizedek guy who's not related to him. He's a priest of the true God out of the middle of nowhere. A priest implies a worshiping community. So there were people who knew God who weren't Israelites. And you wonder, God reaches out and He saves people out of the worst circumstances, including this one. The babies are hard to get your head around. Probably the only part of it that is, but it's a drastic drastic judgment on a culture that the babies were involved in, and they weren't innocent because there's no such thing as innocence.
So how would you, if you're saying that genocide got allowed at once, how would you explain the flood?
How would I explain what?
How would you
flood.
explain the flood if, God wiped out all mankind except for Noah and his family?
Well, they were in a position, again, where this was sin is not stable. Sin destabilizes an individual, it destabilizes a family, it destabilizes a society, and takes it down to levels of degradation that just increase. We're watching this happen in our society right now. And where will it end? Nobody knows. It's already gone to places that 10, 15 years ago we thought it never would.
Right.
So you get to a point where God brings judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And the flood is one of those points.
Right. So it's happened
Even
more
in
than
judgment, there's always redemption.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the most drastic judgment of the flood, there's redemption. There's Noah and his family. And all those years Noah was building that ark, he's also preaching.
Right.
Other people could have been on that boat if they had chosen to. Okay? So let's get back to the very last slide, because I think the direction we're going right now has kind of set that up. The bottom line is this. While the Bible is full of such sobering justice, it's even more full of mercy and hope. For it offers to us the complete pardon and forgiveness of our own sins, given freely in response to faith in Christ, who underwent the destruction we deserve to pay for them. That is where the arc of the biblical narrative leads. Praise the Lord. The thing to remember about judgment, Scripture presents judgment without flinching. The judgment at the flood, the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, the judgment of the Canaanites. But it's always driving things in the direction of redemption. It's realistic about judgment, but it offers mercy and hope, even in the light of such sobering justice. So we get squeamish about God's justice, but nobody in the flood suffered anything they didn't deserve. Nobody in hell is suffering anything they don't deserve. And it's a terrible tragedy that people are going there. And the Great Commission is our mandate to save as many of them as possible from that fate. The people of God are not about genocide. They're not about judgment. They're about redemption. And if you look at just this one slice of Old Testament history, it might be hard to see that because the Israelites are actually performing the judgment. But if you look at the story arc of the whole thing, it's leading past the cross to the empty tomb. To this day, you will be with me in paradise. And that is where it goes. The purpose of judgment is to express God's righteousness. It's also to impel us on the path toward redemption. And that's exactly where we need to be headed.
So I got a question now about these three events, the flood and Sodom and Gomorrah, and then this event. Is it clear in the Bible? Does the Bible give us clear indication that none of these people that were killed during these events are going to end in heaven? So basically all these people that were killed in these three events were non-believers, and they're going to be found in hell at the end. And I just don't know, is that biblically, can you support that with the Bible, or don't we know?
Oh, the Bible doesn't. In none of those three instances is that question even raised. Okay,
Right.
these are judgments, and they're pictures of the ultimate judgment, which is, of course, hell. But the fate of any individual is known only to God. So,
Yeah.
the Sodom and Gomorrah. What is made very clear is, think about Sodom and Gomorrah. What the guys were going to do to the angels, whom they just thought were people who were visiting Lot. I mean, and this is their concept of a good time,
Mm-hmm.
and that's asking for some fire and brimstone, if you ask me. It's asking for it.
Yeah.
And conditions before the flood, we're not given details like we are with Sodom and Gomorrah of how the kind of level of corruption and degradation that existed there. But it's clearly put in terms of man has gotten so sinful. We got to clean this up and start over. And let's find somebody like Noah that we can use to do the starting over and bring mercy.
With Sodom and Gomorrah, it's kind of interesting that there was the question that was raised: if I can find like 50 righteous people, will you spare the city?
Down to 10.
Down to 10, and he kept negotiating. And
would have spared the whole city for the sake of the 10.
Right.
And it ends up only being Lot and his family, and they don't even all make it out because Lot's wife turns back.
Right.
And they're not terribly righteous after they get out of there. Actually, the rest of their story, but there's always mercy, and there's always a path to redemption when judgment comes. And that is true in every case, even in these cases.
Mm.
Even in these cases, Noah, Lot, Rahab, every one of these judgments, we know of one person who was an exception.
Mm.
And one person and a group of people, because the family, and of course, in that society, the family's not the nuclear family. That could be extended family. So, yeah, there it is. It's sobering. It's harsh reality, but it's part of the larger story arc. Don't lose where it's all going in, you're like, you zero in on one day. So if you are zeroed in on Calvary and don't make it to Sunday morning, you're going to get a very distorted picture of the New Testament. And if you're zeroed in on the Canaanite genocide and don't see it as part of the larger story arc, you're also going to get a distorted picture of the Old Testament. and that's what happens.
Mhm.
The Old Testament does not support genocide. It has an example of it that is chilling and sobering, but its general teaching forbids it, and it's part of the whole dynamic of judgment and redemption, which always come together.
Maybe a word that would be
Well,
helpful
it
is,
doesn't.
Always part of it.
maybe a word that would be helpful would be, is it normative in the Old Testament to commit
Yeah.
genocide?
Right.
Yeah, it's a good word. That's a good word.
Normalcy.
I was going to say,
Is it normative?
if it doesn't,
Is it normative? No. Is it normal? No. Neither.
Mm-hmm. Normal or normative.
Yeah.
All right, so Jeff, to kind of circle back to your question earlier on, when someone says you have to presuppose God, perhaps turning it back on them and saying, okay, aren't you presupposing there's a morality that says genocide is wrong? And why should we accept your presupposition on that?
Mm.
See, the problem is we always allow others to put us on a defensive, and there's a time certainly to defend your position, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the opening salvo in these discussions.
Right.
So, I think a brushback like that is helpful, because then you can get to the issue of say, is there an absolute standard by which we can judge these things? If there's an absolute standard by which we can judge these things, where does that come from? It doesn't come from social contracts. That's just mob rule. Whichever mob is making the social contract at any particular time is making the rule. So it's not absolute. It's just whoever's in charge at the time. So if the group in charge decides cannibalism is a good thing, you can't say it's wrong. You can only say it's not my preference, like Don said, I don't like it.
A little tough on them.
But my opinion on it is quite irrelevant.
Right.
Either there's moral absolutes or there's not. If there are moral absolutes, where do they come from? So we have to get back. We walk it back in that direction.
Mm.
You can make a case for the existence of God, certainly, and we've done that several times.
Yeah. The case for the existence of God and the truth of the Christian faith is a multi-layered thing. Okay. If you assume, presuppose that God is there, then morality makes sense, knowledge makes sense. If you don't, then you're going to end up in contradiction, because you're using bits of morality to attack other bits of it. Where did you get them?
Mm.
So the Christian worldview makes sense. The non-Christian worldview leads to contradiction. The historical evidence for the resurrection of Christ is very strong. The evidence for the existence of God from nature, from its intelligent design and its fine-tuning. The heavens declare the glory of God by being intelligently designed and being fine-tuned and being in existence when they can't account for their own existence. It's all these things coming together that creates the case. And so presuppositionalism, I think, has a role to play in that case. The people who want to make it into an ideology and say you have to do it this way, they're missing the many splendored nature of the way in which Christian truth undergirds and intersects with all of reality.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever you look, there's evidence if you have the eyes to see it.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, you've convinced me the Bible does not support genocide, but what about racism, slavery, homophobia?
Well, that's coming up.
Oppression of abusing women.
That's a promo for next couple
Next
weeks.
week, same bat time,
There
same
you go,
bat
Matt
channel, and we will
It-
move on.
Here's
with
something
the-
that I haven't read the chapter, Jeff, but here's something that I'm gonna toss out there just for consideration before we wrap it up for tonight, and that is this: Israel was a theocracy. When God made a covenantal relationship, that was the Constitution that said, "Here's the laws of the land that you will abide by." And so they dealt with those issues in the laws of the land. Now, another nation may not want to live under those laws, but they're not a theocracy either. So that comes into play here. It is that God laid down the law, that's true. But it was laid down the law for a specific land and a specific people. And in a broader sense, it demonstrates to us that we are sinners.
Bottom line.
Certainly does that.
Okay.
Bottom line.
Don, thank you. Everyone else,
Appreciate it.
we will see you all next week.